Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. You're very welcome. My name is Anne Davis and I'm the current president of the PSI. Just one item of housekeeping. If you wouldn't mind turning off your mobile phones or silencing them, that would be really great. Thank you. So I'd like to welcome you to the Sheraton in Athlone for the 46th Annual PSI Conference. And we are very honoured this year to have the Minister of State for Mental Health and Older Adults, Minister Helen McEntee, who's come today to open the conference. So Minister, thank you very much. We really appreciate it, and I'd like to invite you.
Thank you very much. First and foremost, just to start by apologising for my lateness and for holding people up. I don't normally like to be late, so my sincere apologies. Just to say thank you for the kind invitation to be here. I know I met the organisation recently and they asked me would I come down, and I said most certainly and definitely. So I'm delighted to be able to be here to launch, particularly to thank Dr. Anne Davis, to Dr. Michelle Coyle and to Terry Morrissey. And I suppose from the outset to say congratulations on essentially your 46th birthday or your 46th conference, and just to say that I wish you well into the future, and hopefully there'll be 46 more and many after that as well. I think the theme of this year's conference is a very interesting theme. We're talking about identity. I suppose the questions, who are we, where have we come from, and most importantly, where are we going to? I think they're questions that we can all relate to, whether we're male or female, whether we're younger or older, whether we're Irish or not. They're questions, as I said, we can all relate to, and I think it's something that speaks to us all. So I'm delighted to see so many people here, because I know there's a mixture from the organisation and that it's opened up to the public as well. Looking through the different sessions and the topics that are going to be discussed over the coming days, what struck me, I think, was the similarity between the topics that are going to be discussed here, but also the topics that I think are being discussed on a daily basis throughout our country. So within our communities, within our sporting clubs or GAAs, in our schools and our schoolyards, and of course in our homes and around the kitchen table. So first and foremost, you know, what is identity? What does identity mean to us? And I don't mean the county jersey, and we might be able to think of that straight away, but what does it mean? It's something that we all need to ask ourselves. The question around what factors can help us build resilience. So when somebody challenges that very identity, when somebody challenges your very being, how do you deal with that? How do you cope with that? And what factors can you, I suppose, contribute to move forward? The whole transitional period in our life as well. And to pick an example of a mother for the first time, or a first-time mother, while there are a lot of physical changes happening, and we can see them on the outside, there are also a lot of changes happening on the inside, and there are a lot of changes to a person's life, and sometimes those questions that a mother needs to ask can be the most difficult as well. So all of the discussions here throughout the next few days, while they are difficult and they often lead us to, I think, uncharted territory, they're the most important questions that we need to ask, because really we need to be normalising all of these questions. We need to be saying them every day, discussing these issues every day, because if we don't, then we know what the consequences are, and we unfortunately have to deal with the consequences. And I'd say there probably isn't one person in this room that hasn't had to deal with the consequences of somebody not being able to ask a simple question: who am I, why am I here, and where do I need to go? I think it's very clear that our identity is intrinsically linked, I suppose, following on from that, to our mental health and to our well-being. And what we want and what we should strive to have, and as Minister, I suppose, what I would strive for us as a society is to be in a place where people have the ability to question their own identity, and where we give people that space to question their own identity. We're in a very ever-changing world. We're in a very fast-paced world where tomorrow's technology is the following day's old news. And I think as well there's a lot of pressure on people to conform. There's a lot of pressure on people to be a particular type of person, to look a particular type of way, to have a particular type of friends. And again, if we don't actually listen to what it is society is telling us, if we don't actually deal with those issues, then again, I think we'll have to go on to deal with the consequences. I think it's important to say as well that I don't think people intentionally go out to cause harm or to cause difficulty, but I think we need to be conscious of the need to protect and to promote our mental health. So as Minister for Mental Health, again, how do we do that? Within the department, obviously, it's the continued need to increase funding for mental health. It's the continued need to improve our services, but it's the need to listen and to listen to what it is, and if we're not going in the right direction, then to change that direction, and if we are, to improve on that. And that's not just within the Department of Health, and I'm always struck by a referendum which we held recently, a marriage equality referendum, which really had nothing to do with the Department of Health, but for me, I think it probably has had more profound effect on the identity of so many people in this country than we will ever really truly understand. So I think it needs to be an across-the-board approach, and that's something that we all need to work on together. Something that I've started recently myself is our new task force on youth mental health. It's a committee which is comprised of community, public, private, voluntary organisation members, and really the focus is to, first of all, align our services to make sure our services are working, that they can be accessed by our young people, and to make sure that our teams are working well together. But the question that we don't often talk about, or the issue that we don't often deal with, is around, I suppose, the prevention piece. And when a young person asks that question, who am I, where am I going, where do I need to be, then how do we actually help them build a resilience to answer those questions? I'm not that long out of school. I don't consider myself to be that old. However, I know and I can see that the pressures that younger people face today are so far removed from what it is that I dealt with 10 years ago and what people maybe dealt with 20 and 30 years ago. So that task force is in its early stages, and we will be focusing on helping younger people build that resilience to help identify who they are, where they're going, and what it is that they're doing. For some people, I think it is very important to have that identity and to be part of a community and a sense of belonging. And again, another organisation that very much springs to mind, I attended a traveller conference on mental health recently. And while there are a lot of difficulties that the community face, a lot of changes that are needed and supports that they need, one of the things that really stood out to me was that they wanted to be recognised as an ethnic minority, that it's something that they've struggled with, identifying who they are as a group within our society, and something that will cost no money at all, and something that we can do to help their mental health, to help them feel better about themselves, and hopefully that would have a knock-on effect as well. Our programme for partnership government, I think, also recognises the need for further promotion of awareness and prevention strategies, and that really is very much linked within our educational system. So we have Tony Bates speaking after me here from Jigsaw, who I know is doing absolutely fantastic work and beginning to, I suppose, identify or tackle the problem within our schools. And I'm struck by something that was discussed last week at our most recent task force, the notion that if we talk about mental health too much, if we ask too many questions, if we go into all of our schools and tell all of our young people to start talking and to start coming forward if they have issues, then we're not going to be able to deal with the onslaught. And then I think of, years previous when we often think of cancer, and we often refer mental health to cancer, and the fact that we've come a long way with cancer. We wouldn't ever dream of these days saying to somebody, well, you don't really want to know whether you have early stages of cancer, because we might not be able to deal with you and we might not be able to deal with the onslaught. So again, it's around changing that mentality, changing reducing the stigma, but looking at a prevention piece as well. Identity, I think, is something that evolves over time. It's something that can be shaped. It's something that can be informed by many factors. And as Minister for Mental Health, I would recognise the responsibility that we in government have in ensuring that the environment that we help create through our policies and also through our strategies, that they help support absolutely everybody. So everybody in this room, whether you're younger, older, we need to be conscious of that all the time. So once again, I'm late, so I'm not going to hold you up for too much longer. I want to thank the Society for inviting me here. I want to thank you for the work that you're doing to date and say that I look forward to working with you on various different issues into the future to, I suppose, help progress the profession in the area and to make sure that throughout our communities and within our mental health services that we have a complete team to support our people at all stages of life. So I want to wish you well throughout the coming days and just again to thank you for asking me to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. And we very much look forward to working with you as well. We have a psychologist, we always have a lot to say. So as many of you know, that traditionally on the first evening of the conference, we partner with our colleagues from the Northern Irish branch of the British Psychological Society. And so I'm very pleased to welcome Barbara McConnell and Nikki Rooney with us tonight. So you're very welcome. And so this evening we have a long-term member and friend of the PSI. I actually reminded him the very first AGM that I went to. It was Tony who was speaking at that. So he's one of the first people that I ever knew. But we are delighted to have Dr. Tony Bates with us tonight, who is the founding director and the CEO of Jigsaw, and which is really Ireland's, I suppose, national centre for youth mental health. And so I'll invite him up to speak to us, and just to say that when Tony has finished, we will have Barbara who will come up and we will be able to ask questions if you would like. So Tony, we're delighted to have you.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here, really am. And thank you, Michelle and Anne and everyone for inviting me to speak. And thank you, Minister, for being here. I'm very honoured. So let's forgive me if I use some notes, because I put some thought into this, but I haven't. I don't want to go astray in my thinking. So just at my age, that happens much too frequently. But what I want to do is to talk about identity in a playful way. Psychology for me has been my playground all my life, and it's been an amazing playground, and it doesn't, I say that not denying in any sense the gravity of what we deal with and the life and death issues we deal with, but it's been a playground in the sense that it's asked of me over and over again a different kind of creativity. You never get it right. You're always creating, and you're creating with people and for people. And in that active creativity, good things can happen for people and for communities and for organisations. But I do think in a Winnicottian sense that play is the basis of identity. And therefore I wanted to approach tonight as a kind of in a spirit of play. So let's play. So the clothes I wear, the colour of my skin, people to whom I pledge my allegiance, the few friends I would trust with my life. These are all part of who I am. What I hold most dear, my values, my joys, my sorrows, my regrets, they're all part of the story. And that's really good now, because that person, I asked her to do that just because it will tell the rest of you, in case you'd forgotten, to turn off your phones. They're just all part of the ingredients of identity. Identity is the story we tell ourselves about who we are and where we belong, or would like to belong in the world. Partly conscious, partly unconscious. At times it can feel robust and fit for purpose, a roadmap to a brave new world full of possibility and promise. At other times it feels elusive and fragile, a survival strategy we barely manage to cling to in the face of an ever-changing, precarious world. Think of how you felt at 7 when you woke up this morning and turned on the news. Where is my identity? Something in your personal identity brought you here this evening. Perhaps this issue is important to you. Perhaps you know someone or something of the struggle to find an identity that enables you to speak in your voice. Or perhaps you're here out of a sense of loyalty to whoever invited you. Identity got you here, and it does each day and every day in the way it navigates our path into life. Where does it begin? Now I need to go to, sorry, this is not my presentation. 4 fingers. And desktop 3. You're okay. You've taught me well. This is George, who's saved my life. My computer died this afternoon when everything. Can you just beam me up, Scotty? So my computer completely died this afternoon after 5 years, with everything carefully stored away. But we, I was saved by this angel. This is my granddaughter. Recently, she was playing with my glasses, and it struck me. I took the photograph because she was in such a happy place, and she was wearing a dress I bought in TK Maxx for $5.99. She lives in Barcelona, and I just arrived over, and she put the dress on Friday and still had it on Monday and through the night. But it struck me that when I came back and looked at the photograph, it struck me that it's really a child will see the world through our eyes and see themselves through our eyes. It says that for me, and it's so beautiful the way that happens, and so fragile. Adolescence comes and can be a rude awakening, the crumbling away of a world that we had imagined, a world of our parents and teachers and neighbours and peers. The collapse of a world with rules and ideals, and it can come like a blow. In our 20s, we step into spaces and relationships we never imagined. Well, you never imagined, I never imagined I would end up in, as you explore who you are and who you are not. Emerging in your 30s with a readiness to commit yourself to building a life of your own. Learning at 40 to close softly doors to what might have been, to rooms you won't be coming back to. Meeting in your 50s inescapable intimations of mortality. Hitting 60 with a sense of loss, but also gratitude for what you still have. Hopeful at 70 for the blessing of good health and opportunity to savour simple joys. And moving into a new intensity in your 80s, when darkness reveals the light more clearly and you discover, like Eliot, that in the end is my beginning. What I want to do is to reflect on what identity means to us and how we come by it. And when it might be something we want to hold on to, and when it might be something we need to let go of. How we story our lives in creative ways, and how that story can empower us to meet challenges we face. And then how that story can be too small for the challenges and the opportunities we're being invited into. Identity is often challenged as we're confronted with the unexpected, at those edges in our lives where the known meets the unknown, at the limits of our comfort zone. We Irish know all about edges. We have lived and survived for millennia at the edge of the Atlantic Ocean and at the edge of Europe. We've had to endure harsh times when physical comforts were few and all we had was each other. Survival depended on being part of a tight-knit community, bound together by a shared sense of identity. Storytelling was central to our lives. The Blaskets gave us three of our most legendary storytellers, including Peg Sears, who lived in the same, who lived on the same house she was born in for 85 years, and held the patent for tragedy. Somehow her litany of losses didn't break her. Drawing on her imagination and her pipe, she helped that community to relate to their lived experience through story. Stories that had the full palette of light and shade, joy and pain, life and death, love and hate. Her stories didn't just entertain, she turned experience into narrative, and in so doing she gave meaning, even dignity, to their collective experience. Her stories created a sense of cohesion among that small community and mapped their survival. Above all, those stories deepened bonds of friendship between people. Friendship, as she said, was the fastest growing root in our hearts, and we lived in the shadow of one another. Stories created a place for suffering and suggested how to deal with it and how we could be broken by it. Through stories, we warned each other about the way our lives could be lost, not only physically at the hand of nature, but by destruction that we ourselves can bring to our lives and those of our loved ones. We've continued to tell stories, and in new ways we've learned to understand more and more why we are the way we are. Whistle in the Dark, I still count it as one of those unforgettable traumas in my life, the evening I went to see the play, because it was so profound, but it gave me back an image of who I was and what I lived with. My dad was not unlike this man, and I realized, oh my goodness, and I could see myself, and I could see my identity and understand it more. Fintan O'Toole remarks beautifully. These stories help us to delve into the subsoil of our lives, you know, and understand why an entire culture behaves the way it does. Because of, you know, the hard times, we've tended to get locked into certain stereotypes, you know, about the Irish, you know. So Oliver St. John Gogarty said, melancholy is their national pastime, the Irish. Even their drink is black. Samuel Johnson, the Irish are a fair people, they never speak well of one another. Or this one I liked, Mary McGoldrick, who's an anthropologist, a family therapist in New York, and she studied ethnic groups, and this is a long quote, but I think it's so interesting. The Irish are dreamers, but also pragmatic hard workers. They transform themselves from rural peasants into die-hard city dwellers in the United States. They're good-humoured, charming, hospitable and gregarious, but often avoid intimacy. They love a good time, which includes teasing, verbal wordplay and sparring, yet are drawn to tragedy. Although always joking, they seem to struggle continuously against loneliness, depression and silence, believing intensely that life will break your heart. Does that sound a little like? And again, we'll come to this in a minute, that's a story that she wove in the 80s. So what she's saying is that while an American might say, have a nice day, the Irish will say, good luck with that. Now, it can happen that the stories that we make about our own lives or about ourselves as a people become unfit for purpose. And I love this quote from the play Translations by Brian Friel. It can happen that a civilization can be imprisoned in a linguistic contour which no longer matches the landscape of fact. That's what happened this morning in America. The story that was being told did not match the fact of people's experience. And there was such a disharmony, and the people made their voices felt. It's regrettable, some might say, but the point is that there was a narrative that wasn't actually in touch with what was going on in the country. And so I have worried for some time that this could happen. It wasn't an entire surprise, I must say. I was very disappointed. It's troublesome news. So it can happen that we can get attached to idealized stories of our past, or we can get attached to very negative stories of our past, and this is true culturally as well as individually. And there's a time to let if you like, the furniture of the past become a kind of a backdrop, a backdrop to the stage that is our life, so that we're not just banging around with this and that and the other, and that's who I am. I can let those go, those memories, and I can step out into what is real present here and now. And I think that is very interesting how we make those shifts and changes, and I'm very interested in identity as having a continuity and discontinuity. We're both holding a thread of something that stays with us right through our lives, and then that thread or the story gets broken over and over again. That we're making and breaking stories. That's what I think identity is about. This was a story that we told. We told stories about who we were, not just through stories or through theatre, but also through music. And the stories we told ourselves gave us a whole sense of who we were, and this was one of those stories. And while you might say that is such a beautiful gem of Irish history, and it's a part of our identity we need to cherish, it was, and that was 1964 in the Bunclody Cayley band, but Irish music and all that that story was dying on its feet. It was competing with the Beatles, you know, Beach Boys and Pink Floyd, and it didn't have much of a chance against those guys. And it was sort of disappearing and becoming an embarrassment for many people at all. And that story needed to change, and it did. Now, you might think that's not an improvement on the story we had, but it's certainly one that brought us into the 20th century, or the 21st century. And if you were listening to that in 1994, as was broadcast on The Point, you'll notice just as it finished, there is this extraordinary moment, it's a very nanosecond, of pause when people say, "Oh my God, we have this stuff. We have so much more to us than we ever realized." And out of that moment, and I blame that moment entirely and completely for the Celtic Tiger, it came from that sense of that we could do stuff. And when we did it, it was such a novelty that we went off the rails, big time. But that's okay. I often used to use those two bits of music to think, well, you know, it's like the old mental health, the old mental illness paradigm, and then the kind of new, more community mental health. It's a different, and how can we capture that? And I thought this guy had done it really well. But because it's Ireland, I wanted to understand more about it. I wanted to understand particularly where it came from in him. What was it that enabled him to make that shift? And because it's Ireland, I wrote to Bill Whelan. And because it's Ireland, because Bill is Bill, he wrote to me. And I said to him, I want to come and record you, and I want to ask you the most personal questions to try and understand where Riverdance came from. And he said, fine. And I went along with my iPhone and recorded him for 3 hours. And the one question I had was, where did Riverdance come from? But I want you to listen to, this is 1 minute 40 seconds of a 3-hour interview, but I want you to listen to this because I've tried to overlay some of the elements he spoke about, because I think it holds a clue as to how identity grows.
Well, I suppose for me the most important thing to say is that I grew up in a very musical household with both parents at various levels playing music. My mother was a very, very good musician, pianist, classical, and my father was a kind of a self-taught harmonica playing, very broad musician. who, you know, in his head he loved jazz and he loved rock and he loved everything. And again, you know, everything pulls back. You know, I found myself, you know, going back as far back to the first time I heard Dave Brubeck playing Take 5 and those split rhythms when I was a kid, my father played that. And then, you know, I was always interested in those mixed times. So I thought it would be really interesting to do Irish dance in a mixed time. Instead of it being a jig, which is 6/8, or a reel, which is 4/4, we do it in 6/8/4/4. So it goes dig it, 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 dig it. You got 6/8/4/4, 6/8/4/4. And then Michael said, but we must release it to it for the end, and we did. So it was the tension that built up that dig it, 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 and finally that released into the lift for the final statement of the tune.
It strikes me that two things are happening there. One is that Bill is dipping back into memory. And there's a longer story. His dad died at 21. He was a very important person in his life, and he was very close to him. And he was very grief-stricken after his dad's death and didn't deal with it very well. And it took someone in his late 30s kind of calling him to task to really wake him up to what he was doing with his life, which was actually at that time thinking of joining the ESB, because he wasn't quite making it, and he had 4 kids. 39. And he began to remember his dad, and he remembered who he'd been, and he remembered what was important and what had opened his heart. Nietzsche says, or as Albert Camus says, you know, our whole life is just a journey to try and discover through art and literature and love what it was that first opened our heart. You know, we had that moment, and his dad had opened his heart, and he remembered, and he was able to also then look at what the landscape of fact, of what was happening with Irish music, and beginning to see possibilities. So I think identity, for me, is about bridging memory and possibility. It's not denying our past, but it's actually very important that we can remember who we really are. Not just the story, but something that particularly opened us up and woke us up as human beings. Because that's what beckoned us, and that's what's still going to carry us into a different present and a possible future. So what does psychology say about all this? Well, psychology has been saying a lot of things for the last 100 years. But I think this is a very important person, Freud, and he was probably the first real psychological thinker to think about identity. But for Freud, identity was very much the result of what we had introjected, of what we took in from around us and what we learned and what we were told about ourselves, and it all became sort of pooled inside. And to a large degree, you were stuck with it, you know. I mean, you could try and unravel it and get beyond it, but that would take considerable years' work in psychoanalysis. And the problem with psychoanalysis was that, as regards the Irish, we were singularly unsuited to it. So we were stuck with whatever we had inherited. We were stuck. Now, I think that whatever you might think about Freud or Jung, there's no doubt in the world was drawn to psychoanalysis. I mean, Jung probed our minds and found the archetypal unconscious. How cool is that? Suddenly, we all became much more interesting. You know, Freud fragmented our psyche into awesome Greek-named entities. He put the geology of the human personality beyond the reach of most of us, but he left us with no doubt that there are hidden depths within each of us. How comforting it was to know that there was so much more to me than a few minor talents and numerous compulsive, irritating habits that bore the life out of me and everyone around me. I had an Oedipal complex, for heaven's sake. There must be something of some depth in that. We like to behave in a somewhat consistent manner. We try to organise our self-image more or less coherently so that we have a sense of control over our lives. We enjoy and seem to need some level of steadiness. And yet we struggle and we're burdened. Regrets about the past, worries about the future, gnawing fears inside us that we don't quite have what it takes. Why is it so devilishly difficult to figure out who we are and to enjoy being ourselves? Well, Bowlby had some answers. And he found that actually the capacity to do that was really dependent on achieving a certain kind of relationship, a secure bond. First of all, perhaps with our mother or carer, but actually that need for a bond never leaves us, and it actually drives us, and it is the singularly most important drive in our life. The need to secure with someone an affectional bond that gives us sufficient security to look outwards and to explore the world. He would have said, that having that security allows us to tell some kind of a coherent story, and not having it makes it very difficult for us to imagine our lives or see ourselves. He talked about this bond relying on three things, which you all know very well, I'm sure. But it was remarkable. But Jeremy Holmes' biography has talked about how secure attachment is marked by coherent stories that seem to hang together. And he was talking about people who come to him. An insecure attachment, stories is marked by clinging to rigid stories, overwhelmed by unstoried experience, or being unable to find a narrative strong enough to contain. So it's like somehow mental health is being able to story our lives in a coherent way. Mental ill health or mental illness is a story that's never been told. Now, Erickson says, enough of this speculation. And Erickson was a fascinating man. He was, his father was Catholic, his father was Jew, his mother was Jew, and he had a name, I can't remember, Homelson or something. Solomonson was his first name. This man, a man with three surnames, okay? So, it's all about identity confusion. And then the mother never married, that was out of wedlock, as they say, and then she married somebody else, and she got a second name, Hamburger, because it was a Catholic father and a Jewish mother, and he was a Jewish Norwegian or Scandinavian mother, so he had this lovely crop of blonde hair, but he was a Jew, so he never fit in with the Jews, but then he went along with the cool German guys, and he never fit in with them either because he was a Jew. So he was completely befuddled, and eventually when he came to America, he took the name Erickson to kind of really stave off the sort of anti-Semitic movement that was very strong in California at that time. But he lived the struggle, and he said that actually, forget about this notion of inheriting your identity. You've got to find it. It's a task. You've got to build a sense of who you are. You've got to figure it out. And you do that primarily in adolescence, but of course all through life. Now, I'm presenting this very crudely, forgive me, but he saw that identity was kind of something that occurred between two poles, and it was very dynamic, very fluid, and moving. So if you like, you were moving between synthesis and confusion. Synthesis being a sense of knowing who I am, and confusion not having the foggiest who I am. Okay? Now, he loved Martin Luther, who was around at the same time, Martin Luther King Jr., and he wrote a book about Martin Luther King, but he felt that he epitomized identity synthesis, that sense of real clarity. And I think in this short clip you'll see why.
We are able to say to ourselves now that we do count. And I want to say to everybody under the sound of my voice this afternoon that you are somebody. Don't let anybody make you feel that you are nobody. You are somebody, you have dignity, you have worth. Don't be ashamed of yourself, and don't be ashamed of your heritage. Don't be ashamed of your color. Don't be ashamed of your
But just remember, in terms of identity, each of you had a dream, and probably what has you in this room. And it's part of what brought you. And again, we're always checking in where we are with that dream. And he just reminded us that we have our dream. It's not that he had a dream. We all have a dream. That's synthesis. Now, of course, it's not always, easy to answer the question. And sometimes you can be very confused. And I just was lucky enough to find a piece of archival footage from APA which shows what living with identity confusion is like and how it gets played out in our relationships with others. So watch carefully.
Kevin. You're going to thank him, Mum. No. I'm going to say thank you. I just bloody did!
Yes, it did. It's not like this.
Oh, this is lovely, Mum. How's the exam today? Alright. What was it today? Maths? No. Sorry, what did you say? Oh, physics!
Parents can be so frustrating, can't they be? So there is this, and of course it's the journey. For Erickson, I think that what just to say, I think the other example that he used, because Kevin and Perry wasn't around in those days, but he used the example of Willie Loman from Death of a Salesman. And if you remember Willie Loman, his father had built him up to be something magnificent, something amazing, somebody he simply was never going to be. But Willie, his whole life is this crisis of torment of trying to be something he could not be. And then eventually breaking through that to be able to claim a right to be who he was. But at one time he says to his mum, I just can't take hold, Mum. I just can't take hold of some kind of life. It's a very difficult and dark place to be. For Erickson, the benchmark for a robust identity was there he is. Was a phrase that seems unusual from the lips of a psychoanalyst, but it was fidelity to my sense of truthfulness. In childhood, we are born whole and unable to be anything but what we are, happy, sad, whatever. What you see is what you get. What you are is what you give. We can lose that capacity to be real and present. In our families, in our schools, in our communities, we learn all too often that it's not safe to be in the world as we truly are. If you express your true feelings, your deepest identity, your sexuality, you're going to be disliked, bullied, ignored, or alienated. So we learn to project a safe, acceptable identity because there are aspects of ourselves we don't dare to bring into the world for fear of something bad happening. If living such a divided life continues over time, we reach a point where it becomes terribly painful and where it becomes exhausting. What Winnicott says about adolescence is that to a young person committed to integrity, the adoption of a false self can feel unbearable. Now, Erickson is kind of someone that he sort of has left his footprint in history, there's no doubt about that, but I think he hasn't been fully incorporated, I would say, within sort of developmental psychology. And the reasons for that are valid because he spoke he painted pictures rather than in strict terms. And when in later life he was challenged with this, he made a comment I think is worth listening to. He said, I came to psychology from art, and he was an artist, and then he became a Montessori teacher, and then he got therapy with Anna Freud. If not, which may explain, if not justify, the fact that at times the reader will find me painting context and backgrounds where he or she would have rather had me point to facts and landscapes. But what he said was, and I love this, is that all I can offer is another way to look at things. And I do feel as psychologists, the best we can offer is simply another way to look at things. And hopefully a way to look at things that opens people's identities up rather than closes them down. Now, but of course psychologists as scientists like to be precise when it comes to human behaviour. And so in 1984, people began to look much more precisely at some of these concepts. And so James Marcia developed what he called identity status theory. And what he's doing, he's saying there's two independent dimensions to identity. There's a sense of commitment and a sense of exploration. Ideally, we explore and we commit, and that's the way he saw it. So you have exploration, commitment, and depending on whether you have, say, low exploration and low commitment, you've got one kind of state of being. And these are different possible states. So you can be highly committed, having explored a lot, or you can be highly exploring but not making any commitments. So these are the different possibilities for how we achieve identity. And in the low commitment, low exploration, if we're not looking, if we're not searching, and if we're not actually committing to anything, we become very diffused. I had a woman the other evening came to me and just for advice, the daughter of a physician friend, and she's 30 and she's immensely talented, but she said, I can't commit. I can't commit. I've been doing all kinds of noble, altruistic things all her life, but I can't commit. And she said, I'm just terrified. If I commit, I will miss something. And if I commit, I will be overwhelmed with the regret of having made the wrong choice. So that comes to partners, it comes to careers, and so she has no job. She has a tentative, ambivalent relationship with a boyfriend, but she's terrified. And she said, can you tell me how to commit? And it's a big question. There are other people who quite deliberately don't commit, but seem to be able to kind of, put a moratorium on identity and enjoy the searching, seeking, exploring, and probably particularly in teens and 20s, that is a time. Those who don't explore but commit are often people who foreclose. And the term Marcy used was premature foreclosure, which sounded odd, but it was really important because at times we just lock down. I'm a Fianna Fáil, that's me. The family were always Fianna Fáil. I'm Fianna Fáil, sorry, Mr. Or Fianna Gael. And that's who I am, and that's it. But actually in ethnic groups this can be very important because there's a sense of a whole recipe or a whole recommended portfolio of behaviour and lifestyles that go with their tradition, and that's handed on and taken on. So there might be very little chance to explore, but there's a very strong sense of this is who I am, what I do. And then high experience is that real achievement of identity. And what researchers since Marcy have found is that being in transition and not being sure is a very difficult place to be, and to varying degrees. And then having a foreclosed sense of identity or achievement seems to be very clear. So in other words, that if we're in any sense trying to find identity or reconsider identity, especially when we're going through, it's fluctuating and we're very confused for a lot of the time, it leads to heightened levels of anxiety and depression. Now there's a few things about that. One is, I'd rather have somebody who's anxious and depressed and genuinely searching than somebody who's achieved a sense of identity which they're now not going to let go of for fear of, at any cost. And actually they need to let it go. Maybe they're a happy single young man and they need to move on. But they have no symptoms and they're very happy and they might seem much more healthy. But I ask you, who is the healthiest? The person who's realizing, this partying and this drinking and this stuff, kind of it's great, but maybe there's something more I need to do with my life. So I think we need to always be mindful of those who are struggling and whose struggle is a real attempt to get beyond something that's not working in their lives, and those who are genuinely lost and drifting and need some real support to kind of build a story that they can live with. The other things that have been found missing, I think, in Marcy and all the identity people's theory is a sense of what it takes from outside. That I can't just do this. It's not an internal cognitive process that I go through and I sort it all out. No, it's a much more relational. It's very influenced by social context, by what's happening and who I'm with. And I think, nobody has said this more than Winnicott, who I think, whose writings I still go back to, I must say. A sense of identity is essential for every human being. It cannot take place without a facilitating environment, which needs to have a human quality, not a mechanical perfection. So the phrase good enough parent seems to me to describe what a child needs to grow. And I think that's very important in our work with families and parents, that you don't have to be a perfect parent, you just need to be good enough. And you are this child's parent, and actually nobody else can fill that role, really. So that in a sense is good. And I think he set the bar in very achievable ways. And that need for a good enough, person to support us remains again through life, and is very important. And in our work, when I set up Headstrong, and I worked closely with Barbara Dooley, and we designed this survey of youth mental health, My World Survey, and we looked at about 7,000 12 to 17-year-olds and about 8,000 18 to 25-year-olds, and they did about 20 scales in different ways, and took 5 years to get this right, but gave us 1.5 million data points, and you could model. And when we asked the data, what is it that predicts most powerfully recovery, resilience, mental health? We didn't use the word identity, but it's one I'd go back and look at now. Here's what we found.
The My World Survey is Ireland's first national study of youth mental health. This was a report that was published in 2012 based on data we collected on over 14,000 young people in Ireland. And we looked at really important things for these young people. We looked at positive things in their lives, such as how well they're coping, and the supports they have, and their sense of optimism, their self-esteem. And then we also looked at negative things, such as their anxieties, their depression, and alcohol behaviour, things that might impact on their mental health. We also asked them, is there an adult in your life that's there when you're in need? And we found some really interesting things come out of these data. Firstly, the majority of young people had a one good adult in their life that was there either all the time or nearly all the time. So that was 71%. So quite a lot of young people have a one good adult that's there for them. However, there were a proportion of these young people that didn't have the support readily available to them. What was key was to look at what's the importance of a one good adult in a young person's life. We found that it was important for them personally, such as their self-esteem, which is much higher if they have the presence of a one good adult in their life. It was important for their school. We see that they're connected to their school, their peers, they feel they're doing better at school. It's connected to their mental health. They tend to have lower levels of depression, anxiety, stress. It's connected to help seeking. Young people who have the presence of one good adult are more likely to seek help, which is key in terms of encountering difficulties. And it's also connected to things like their risk-taking behaviours and their negative behaviours. They're less likely to engage in risky alcohol, less likely to get in trouble with the police, less likely to actually engage in substance misuse. So when we look at all of these things together, we see that a one good adult is key to how well an adolescent is doing.
So Dr. Barbara Dooley should read Professor Barbara Dooley now. Well done, Barbara. I often think, what is that one good adult? And it's fun. I've worked with different groups, including the Irish rugby team, and asked them, who was your one good adult? I remember Brian put his hand up immediately and said his mother. And then he said, oh, I should have said Amy. And no, but he said his mother, he was God. But his mother is a fascinating woman, and a great deal of what's behind that, the courage that he has and that he manifests so well. I think one good adult is somebody who looks at young people in a certain way. Not all young people, but just knows a young person, knows them personally, believes in them, and kind of sees possibilities. And that glance, which can be a teacher, it can be a parent, it can be a godparent, it can be an aunt, uncle, a grandparent, but it's that person who sees something in them. It's not just somebody who accepts them or who's empathic with them, but it's somebody who affirms them and who can see what's possible. I had a number of rows with my wife over the years. I remember one in particular. She was very good at it. I wasn't so good, and I often left the field of play rather than deal with the issues. But I remember this one occasion where she got me about something, and I knew she was wrong. I knew I had the moral ground, and that this was unfair. And I mustered up all the energy I could, and I looked to her and I said, I know what's wrong here. And I said, you don't accept me as I am. Because I've been trained in Rogerian therapy and so on, so I knew all about the importance of unconditional positive regard. You don't accept me as I am. And she looked back at me and says, you're damn right I don't. I have plans for you. Now I think that's love, and I think that's actually the kind of love that we need to have. We can get, locked into stories and trapped in history. I love this quote of James Baldwin, people can be trapped in history and history trapped in them. And sometimes we see people and we work with them who have very unhelpful sense of who they are, a very negative, a very punitive sense of who they are. They're violent towards themselves for who they are. They don't like that person. I remember one guy saying to me, Doctor, it's not that I think I'm a loser, I am a fucking loser. And that was his point, that was his identity. And I think the question, working with people in James's particularly, why is it so hard to let go of an identity that isn't working? And I think that it's hard because it's all we have sometimes. It's the only way I know myself, and if I was to let that go, what would I do? What would I become? And often I think therapy is giving people a space where they can let go and be held in a place of tremendous uncertainty, tremendous ambiguity, and great fear. But as they begin to recast and recraft a different story. I remember one called her Julie, and Julie, midway through a social phobia group program, said she was beginning, unfortunately for her, to get better. And she said to me at the end, who am I going to be if I'm not anxious? Terrified to let go. So, what have we learned about identity? Briefly, I think identity is dynamic and fluid. Identity formation is dependent on a facilitating environment, a relationship, an environment, a social context. Uncertainty is associated with a lot of low mood and anxiety, and at times that can be no harm, and at times it can be worrying. Making commitments protects against anxiety and depression. I didn't say that, but on all the research, that where there was some commitment to something, it seemed to help a lot. And sometimes we just need to ask, what can I do today? And what can I deal with today? And my identity is a very concrete, short-term affair. I'm not answering the big question. And finally, I think the most vulnerable have most difficulty with letting go constricted, negative self-identity. It's the people who have a poorly formed sense of who they are, who actually cling to it the most, the insecurely attached people. And I think they need most help, and they need very skillful help to do that. I'm coming towards the end, but I want to say something about my own work over the last 10 years with young people in Ireland, and we have some data, and I thought it would be interesting to ask, what does the data reveal to us about identity formation in our young people, particularly our more troubled young people? In 2006, we were telling a story about Ireland, and it was largely about young people, and about suicide, and about self-harm, and about the immense vulnerability of those young people. I had been 25, 30 years in James's working with people who didn't really know who they were, and who often pretended to be something else, and that was just the staff. The so-called patients were people whose identities were not working for them, but we often had the most extraordinary conversations about who they were, and I so appreciate those years. But one of the things they said to me so often was, if only I'd had somebody to talk to when I was 14. And it seemed that, and there was wonderful work being done in adult psychiatry, but it seemed to me that many of the people we saw, it was too little too late, And when you keep hearing this, if only, if only, if only, if only, it comes to a point where you say, look, to heck with it, I'm going to give this a go. And I left to see if we could set up something for younger people. And I didn't know what I was doing, but I had a rough idea of where I wanted to get to. there was international literature, and in working particularly with Vision for Change and beyond that group, I actually learned a lot that this is without doubt the most exquisitely vulnerable time of life for mental health. You know, I mean, later on we have other concerns. You can, take your pick really, cardiovascular, cancer, sensory, neurological. There's special deals on all of them as you move into your 80s, 70s. But when you're between 10 and 25 particularly, mental health is the issue, and it's when things arise. In my world, we'd found kind of alarming, and again, these findings and issues don't mean anything. You really think about them. 8% of young adults, these are the 12 to 17, and 14% of the older had severe or very severe depression symptoms. It's a lot. 11% of young and 14% had severe to very severe anxiety, all measured on very standardized medical good instruments. And then 21% of young adults, and these are the 18 to 25, reported engaging in self-harm in the previous 12 months. And 18% of young adults and 18% of older adults report very little adult support in their lives. But the one that was really troubling was these suicide questions we asked. And this was 8,000 18 to 25-year-olds. So think about this. Think about the numbers. And these, again, very carefully conducted survey research. 43% had at some point in their life thought their life was not worth living. 35% thought this in the last 6 months. It's 1/3. 52% thought about taking their life, 28% in the last 6 months. 22% reported deliberately hurting themselves without wanting to take their own life in the past 12 months. And 7%, that's 499 people, have at some point made an attempt on their life. 14% of those had done so in the last 6 months. These are very high rates. So one of our young people who wrote at the time about the 10,000 of teenagers, the thousands of teenagers who are somehow managing to kind of live their lives while secretly disintegrating. I think more than anything what I've learned is that the distress in young people is largely hidden. It's largely fear. It's a fear that they will not be able to cope with their lives. A fear they will not be good enough, a fear they will let us down, and a fear that they cannot tell us for fear that we would reject them. And this is just, anxiety is certainly the dominant theme that we have seen. There was nowhere to turn in those dark moments, so we worked with young people, and this was perhaps the most inspiring thing I've ever done, is actually to realize that I didn't know what they needed. I didn't know what mental health meant to them. And yet working with them gave me a different way into this conversation. And asking them what would work for you, and creating a space was very important. Being in my own company, and I'm delighted I do. But I think the other side of that is that I feel a growing sense of how connected even we all are here. I mean, we are all on the same journey. We may be in different places, but we're on the road to becoming human. And there's something about that that's not a cliche anymore. It feels terribly important. And when you see so many things stripped from people you've loved and you've grown up with, health and well-being and physical mobility and physical capacities, it comes down to some very basics, And I have been in those spaces myself of near death, and it's been, there's nothing like near death to focus the mind and to make you deeply grateful for simpler things. I'd say my life has become much simpler, actually, and I am more simple, and I've kind of let go. Oh, that's the other thing. This thing, you can be whatever you want. You have a right to be happy. All those cliches are spoken by people who are just running away from being human. Okay, we can't be anything we want. I mean, it just doesn't work. There are limits that I have. There are limits around me. And it's very important to have that sense of respect for those limits. I don't have to be everything, for God's sake. There was a time I knew I could be a wonderful concert pianist. I had that absolute gift if only I played the piano. And there were so many things, but that's why I put that thing about closing doors. There's such a freedom in closing doors, and just being, because I don't have to be everything. And I can be terribly happy with very little. So I sometimes wonder about the messages we give very young. Their mythology is it's full of infinite possibilities, and you can't possibly measure up to those things. So for me, yeah, I do see it is a sense of, I think, real, I'd say before I might have looked at you and there was that much distance, and now the gap has narrowed. I feel much closer.
Do you mind?
Yeah.
A different thing. To what extent have you found that self-disclosure is helpful in your work with others?
Well, there's always a risk of indulging oneself and then boring the other to tears. But I do come back to Roger's thing of, authenticity and being real. I think people know when you're being real and they know when you're being present. They don't have to know the minutiae of my torment. Or my past torment or something, It can be helpful, and I'm not afraid to say that, but I'm probably slightly more disciplined than I used to be in terms of just self-disclosure. I have no problem sharing, being real, but I try to be present. It's actually not about me. If I'm with you, it's what you need of me is to be present and be real with you, and that's where my energy has to be. And that's a choice. Okay.
Can I
Sorry.
ask a question?
Sure. Yeah.
Thank
Yeah.
you. Obviously, the age range that you're working with
Yeah.
is are young people,
Yeah.
and they're self-referring to your organisation, but they are all in schools.
Yeah.
Most of the children are going to be in schools, the young people. What role then do teachers have in being able to support some of these mental health problems, particularly now with gender identity issues?
Yeah.
Certainly in the north, we have many schools that are facing challenges now with children wanting to change identity whilst in single-sex schools and things. So,
well, let me offer a little self-disclosure and answer that question, because I came to that same point of realising that we weren't really addressing schools, and at the end of September I stepped down as CEO after 10.5 years, and that was a letting go of a certain identity, and I'd say October was a month of mourning, even though I was completely clear I wanted to do that, and nothing would make me go back in the world. But that doesn't matter. The heart has its reasons. You feel a loss. So there's that loss. But the loss for me was to free myself up, because the story I had of myself wasn't big enough for what you were asking. There is a real need to address in some creative way, and I do not mean to go into schools with more and more little talks and that we do a lot of that, and that's good, but it's not cutting it. And I think, as I've just been, since October, I've been involved in a scoping exercise, interviewing 20-30 principal schools, focus groups, and what's coming through, and it's important for us to know it, is that there's a kind of a sense of we're saying all the time to people, you really need to appreciate the mental health needs of your students, you need to give them support and this and that and the other, and you need to make it a school-wide or a whole school thing. It has to be strategic, it can't just be adding another counsellor or something else. That's not going to do it. And what none of us, I think, realise is that teachers are terrified, and principals particularly are terrified. And so many have said to me, Tony, I get it, but I don't know how to deal with this. Nobody has ever talked to us about how to be a fucking good adult, to a kid who is in trouble. Nobody's talked to us about how to engage with somebody who comes in floods of tears and their parents are separating. And the guidance counsellor is not in that day. So there is a sense that they naturally protect themselves against that by passing it down often to the earheads and just keeping a distance. And I think that the question I'm thinking about now is, how could you actually really build capacity? And it's not to turn them into therapists, it's to build confidence and some very simple practical skills that they need to engage those teachers. And I think we need to start with the leadership. and then let it percolate down, you know. But I think we've tended to go in, I mean, it's sort of being assaulted by people going in and doing these talks about suicide or something. And the kids are all riled up after it, and the person leaves, and that's all very nice. And the teachers, they go to the teachers and you don't know what to say. And some of you maybe be teachers and you know what this feels like. So I think there's a sense in which we need to really, if we're seeing the good adult as being an essential predictor of mental health in the lives of students, we need to build that capacity in people rather than just ask them to be it. You know, it's not enough to say, you got to do this. You know, I might have said that before. Why can't they just do it? They're great, you know. So my life now is singularly focused on this issue, and whether I do anything or not, I'm not sure. I'm working out a strategic plan. I'm working with all the key stakeholders. But you know, if I can add value, I'd love to. I really feel your question, and it's not being answered. And I can say that having spoken to all our partners and colleagues and so on, it's not being answered. There are great little examples, but it's not. We haven't cracked that one. Yes.
Yeah. Hi, Tony. Just want to say, yeah, brilliant presentation.
Oh, thank you so much.
I suppose I was amused when I heard you mention about Peg Sayers, because I have really fond memories of Peg. Police are probably not fond at the time, but now I affection for Peg Sayers. And I just think about the explosion of mental health with our youth. Do you have any thinking about, like, has there been a generational change in resilience, or does that come into it at all?
I'm not, my jury's out on that. I'm not convinced that it's a more or less stressful time. There are different stresses, but I think I have a sense that, you know, they're all in many ways far more equipped to talk about things, to articulate. You know, I mean, we found 70%, we're doing quite well actually in the My World survey, so we need to say that, and Barbara always does. But I really think that, and I think they have, but our story about them may be changing. You know, I mean, I joke around, you know, none of them had read the DSM, but actually there is a sense that what people have said to us is that being listened to and not labelled is very important. Being given concrete tasks, we set goals when they come in. What is it you'd like to do that would make a difference in your life? And achieving a concrete short-term goal restores some feeling of agency and some feeling, and again it's that commitment which I think brings people out of confusion. So there are things happening within short times, that capacities in them, but I don't know. I just don't know where. I mean, I think that many of the young people we see, there are very real reasons they feel upset. If there's one intervention I have for young people, it's simply to say, whatever you're feeling, I bet there's a very good reason for it, and you and I need to figure that out, you know. But in the sense that and I just find they come with you, you know. So I don't know. I don't have experience of other generations of working with them. My own kids, I completely failed, and they are, you know, spend most of their adolescence in rehab, and you know, didn't get to see them much. So when I started this, I had to assemble young people around me to ask them, what on earth is going on, you know? Maybe it's worth, my own adolescence was a, you know, a battlefield. I mean, it was just, you know, it's not something, you know, it's, so I don't know. But I do know that out of these bad times, we forge identity. You know, we also forge identity when we're loved. You know, that it's given. Somebody pulls us out by the ears and sees the good in us, and that is fabulous. You know, but I think it's also true that, you know, a lot of us, it's emerging out of our own struggle with these things. So it's important that whatever the things are, that we're not seeing them as a fault in the young people. It's just a kind of a difficulty in their relationship with life that needs to be addressed. And they may need skills and time, and these things can be quite intricate, I get that. But yeah, let's go for it.
I wonder myself at the moment, just the pressure from social media,
yeah,
which is now very clear, which generation ago
yeah.
would have been.
Yeah. I think that you're absolutely right. It is a different and substantive pressure that causes great suffering in people. And one young woman said to me, Tony, 15, she said, there's never been a generation who communicate more, and we've never been so out of touch with each other. You know, she's 15. I thought that was amazing. You know.
Time for one last question.
Yeah.
What's the last one?
I'd just like to say I was very deeply touched
Thank you.
by this. It's the best, I think, seminar I've ever been to, and I've been around a long time. And as a behavior analyst, I don't get emotionally or don't get in touch with myself all that often, but this brought me right back. And this morning, I had to face an identity crisis about being American.
Yeah.
And I feel on the verge of tears right now,
Yeah.
which doesn't happen to me. And 23 years in Ireland, but I'm American.
Sure.
You know, and,
Sure.
and that whole sense of who am I and that part of me, and that's my country. And I called my husband, who's Irish and emigrated, lives in Fort Lauderdale, and I'm here. But I said to him, my America is gone. You know, my home it'll never be the same for the rest of my life, because I'm 69. And so now, even if we're talking about children struggling, but myself, with a pretty strong sense of who I am, I've been shaken deeply. And this talk has really been very helpful to me. So I'd like to thank you so much.
You know, it's interesting this thing, because I imagine you're just echoing what millions of people are saying at this very moment. And it just listening to you, I'm just struck that, yes, I hear the loss of identity, but I also hear you grappling with what you most value about being American and reclaiming that. And out of that dust, something could really come. If there are 100 million people feeling the same as you, I want to reclaim what has been taken, and I want to redefine who I am, because identity does become so acute in these moments of when our world collapses. It is an exciting time.
I said that to Andy this morning. I said, my beliefs and my attitudes, you know, but they're mine, and they will always be mine.
Yeah.
It's just a struggle that so many people now are so self-centered.
There is that. Yeah.
You know, that's been lost in the majority of Americans, and that makes me very sad.
Thank you.
Can we just end by another show of our appreciation for Tony?
Thank you.
So for those of you who are here and who are staying for the conference, I hope you learn lots. I hope you meet up with old friends, and I hope you have lots and lots of fun. So yeah, thank you for coming this evening.